The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Ilara Voss would later think was cruel. Thursday was not the day for life-changing things. Thursday was for bread baking and mending and the dull, predictable rhythm of a household that had quietly run out of money. But there it was, sitting on the kitchen table when she came downstairs before dawn, sealed in dark blue wax with a crest she did not recognize at first, a falcon with its wings folded, looking down at something the envelope could not show her. Her mother had already read it. Ilara could tell by the way she stood at the window with her back turned, her hands clasped so tightly behind her that her knuckles were white. Her mother, Catherine Voss, was a woman who had spent 20 years being graceful about difficult things. She had been graceful when Ilara's father died and left nothing but debt. She had been graceful when they sold the carriage, then the silver, then the good dining chairs. She had even been graceful when Ilara's younger brother Oliver had to leave his school in the middle of the term because they could not pay the fees. But standing at the window that Thursday morning, Catherine Voss was not being graceful. She was being very, very still, which was different. Ilara picked up the letter. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, which is what she always did when something did not make sense on the first pass. The language was formal and careful, the kind of language that men used when they wanted to say something uncomfortable without appearing to be the one saying it. The writer identified himself as Mr. Gerald Holt, solicitor to the Ashmore estate. He wrote on behalf of His Grace, the Duke of Ashmore. He wrote that the Duke's younger brother, Lord Edmund Ashmore, was in declining health and had expressed a wish to marry before the end of his illness. He wrote that the Ashmore family was seeking a suitable young woman of good character from a respectable family, and that the Voss name had come to their attention through a mutual connection. He wrote that should Miss Ilara Voss agree to travel to Ashmore Hall for an initial meeting, all expenses of the journey would be covered, and a settlement would be discussed. He did not write what kind of settlement. He did not write what declining health meant exactly. He did not write what happened to the wife of a lord who died. Ilara set the letter down very carefully on the table, as if it might go off if she was not careful. She looked at the back of her mother's head. "When did this come?" she asked. "Yesterday evening," Catherine said without turning. "I did not want to disturb your sleep." "You read it?" "Of course I read it." Ilara pulled out a chair and sat down. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in a pale, uncertain way, the way it did in late November when it was not sure whether to be morning or keep trying to be night. The kitchen was cold. The fire had not been lit yet. Everything was very still. "They want to pay someone to marry a dying man," Ilara said. "That is one way to phrase it. Is there another way?" Catherine turned from the window then. Her face was composed, her eyes were not. "They are offering a settlement that would clear the house debt twice over, Ilara. They are offering a monthly allowance during the marriage that would allow Oliver to return to school. They are offering—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It is more money than your father earned in his best year." Ilara looked at the letter again. "And after he dies?" "Mr. Holt's letter says that is a matter for further discussion." "That is not an answer." "No," her mother agreed, "it is not." Ilara was 23 years old. She was not a romantic. She had stopped being a romantic approximately 3 months after her father's death, when she had sat down with his accounts and realized that love, however genuine, does not keep the roof from leaking. She was practical. She was organized. She could stretch a week of groceries to 10 days and make it look like abundance. She had learned to smile at people she did not like and to keep her opinions to herself when they would have cost more than they were worth. But she had never imagined this. She sat in the cold kitchen for a long time. Her mother did not speak. That was one of the things Ilara had always respected about Catherine. She knew when to let silence do its work. "I want to meet them first," Ilara said at last. "That is all the letter asks. If the man is cruel, or if the terms are wrong, I come home." "Of course. And if I say no after the meeting, that is final. No convincing, no guilt." Catherine walked to the table and placed one hand over Ilara's. Her hand was very cold. "It is your life," she said. "I will not tell you what to do with it." Ilara looked at her mother's face for a long moment. Then she looked at the crest on the letter again, the falcon with its wings folded, looking down. "Write back to Mr. Holt," she said. "Tell him I will come." The journey to Ashmore Hall took 2 days by train and 1/2 day by carriage, and by the time Ilara arrived she had already decided 3 things. First, she would not be impressed. Second, she would not be afraid. Third, she would say very little until she understood what kind of people she was dealing with, because the kind of people who could afford to arrange a marriage by letter were usually the kind of people who expected everyone else to be grateful and say so loudly. The carriage turned off the main road and onto a long drive lined with oak trees that had lost most of their leaves. December had come in hard that year, and the ground was frozen in rough ridges that made the carriage rock. Through the window, Ilara watched the house appear gradually, first the chimneys, then the roofline, then the full face of it, grey stone and tall windows and ivy gone brown for the winter. It was not the largest house she had ever seen, but it had the quality of a place that did not need to be the largest house in order to make you feel small. She straightened her back and looked away from it, out the other window at the bare trees. A man named Greaves met her at the door. He was the house steward, she would later learn, a compact, careful man with a watchful quality that reminded her of people who had worked in important houses long enough to see everything and had decided to react to none of it. He took her coat. He showed her to a room that was warm and simply furnished and had a view of the back gardens, which were dormant and grey and somehow still beautiful in a stern, bare-bones way. He told her dinner would be at 7. He told her she would meet Lord Edmund in the morning, as he had been tired that afternoon. He told her that His Grace would receive her in the study at 5:30 before dinner. She thanked him and he left, and she stood in the middle of the room for a moment before she went to the window and looked at the gardens, because she needed something to look at that was not walls. 5:30 came the way 5:30 always does when you are not ready for it, abruptly, with no real warning. Greaves came to her door, knocked once, and led her down a corridor lined with portraits and through a door that was heavier than it looked. The study was large. It smelled of wood and old paper and something she could not name, something cool and sharp. There was a fire at the far end. The room was full of books, not decorative books, but real ones, with worn spines and papers tucked between them and margins she could tell had been written in. The Duke of Ashmore was standing near the fire with his back to the door. He did not turn when she entered. She had expected this or something like it. Men with titles and large houses often performed their power through small gestures, the turned back, the slight delay, the studied movement that told you they were not hurrying for anyone. She had decided she would not react to it. She stood just inside the door and waited. After a moment he turned. He was younger than she had expected. She was not sure why she had expected older, perhaps because the letter had been so formal, or because people with the word Duke attached to their names always seemed ancient in the imagination, weighed down by all that title. But Lord Caelan Ashmore was perhaps 32, maybe 33, and he was, she noted this the way she noted useful facts flatly without attaching feeling to it, the kind of man that made a room recalibrate. Tall, not in an obvious way, but in the way that was simply present. Dark-haired, a jaw like something cut with a purpose. Eyes that were grey and entirely still, watching her with an attention that was not rude but was also not particularly warm. He looked at her for a moment, she looked back. "Miss Voss," he said, his voice was even. "Thank you for making the journey." "Thank you for the carriage," she said. "It was a long road." Something crossed his face, she could not name it. "Please," he said, and gestured toward 2 chairs near the fire. He sat across from her, not close, with a low table between them. A tea tray was there, already poured. She did not reach for it yet, neither did he. "I imagine," he said, "that Mr. Holt's letter raised more questions than it answered." "Several," she said. "Would you like me to list them, or would you prefer to simply tell me what I need to know?" He looked at her, that slight thing crossed his face again. "The second," he said. He spoke for 15 minutes, without hesitation or decoration. He told her Edmund was 28 and had been ill with a lung condition for 2 years. The doctors had given him somewhere between 3 months and a year, depending on the winter. Edmund had decided with characteristic stubbornness that he did not want to die unmarried, and that he did not want a marriage arranged among the usual circles, where the women would spend the rest of their lives being pitied for it. He wanted someone who came into the arrangement with open eyes, who would be honest with him, and who would be comfortable enough in their own character not to perform grief when the end came. The settlement was real. The monthly allowance was real. There would be a further provision in Edmund's own will, the terms of which would be discussed if she agreed to proceed. There were no hidden conditions. She would be free to leave after Edmund's death or to stay if she chose. He said all of this looking directly at her, and she noticed that he did not soften a single word of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, She picked up her tea. It was very good tea, she noticed. Strong and properly made, not the watery thing that people served when they were being polite rather than generous. "You said Edmund decided this himself," she said. "Yes. And what did you decide?" Something shifted in his stillness, just slightly. "I decided to help him." "That is not quite what I asked." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it is not." She held his gaze for another moment, then looked down at her cup. "I would like to meet Lord Edmund before I give any answer." "I expected you would," he said. "He will be well enough in the morning." She nodded. She set down her cup. She stood and he stood, and she moved toward the door, and she was almost through it when she stopped and looked back. "You have a great many books," she said. "Have you read them?" He looked at her steadily. "Most of them," he said. She considered this, then she nodded once and left. At dinner that evening, there were only the two of them at a table long enough for 12. The food was very good, and there was too much of it, and they ate without speaking very much, which she found comfortable in a way she had not expected. She had prepared herself for awkward conversation, for the performance of pleasantness that strangers at dinner tables usually felt obligated to produce. But Kaylan Ashmore did not perform pleasantness. He asked her twice if she wanted more of something. He mentioned once that the roads in December were worse than usual this year. She said she had noticed. He nodded. They did not speak again until the end of the meal, when he set down his napkin and said, without looking at her, "Edmund is a good man." She looked up. "I want you to know that," he said, "before you meet him. Not because I think you will doubt it, but because it is true and I find I want to say it." She looked at him for a moment. She thought of her mother's two still back at the window. She thought of Oliver's school uniform that did not fit him anymore because she had not been able to afford a new one. She thought of the letter and the dark blue wax and the falcon looking down at something she still could not see. "I believe you," she said. And she did, which surprised her, because she had not expected to believe anything in this house quite so quickly. She lay awake for a long time that night in the warm, simply furnished room with the view of the dark gardens, listening to the wind move through the oak trees on the drive. The house was very quiet around her. She thought about all the things that had not been said at dinner. She thought about the way Kaylan Ashmore had looked at the fire when he told her Edmund was a good man, not at her, as if the words were for the room and not for her specifically, as if he said them to keep them from becoming too private. She turned onto her side. She looked at the dark window. Outside, the oak trees moved in the wind, bare and stubborn and entirely themselves. She thought, "I have not agreed to anything yet." And then she thought, "I am still here." And those two things sat in her chest, side by side, and she was not sure what they meant. Edmund Ashmore's room was on the second floor, on the east side of the house where the morning light came first, and when Greaves brought her there the next morning just after 9, she could hear, even before the door opened, the sound of someone talking and then laughing at their own words, which she found immediately interesting. The room was bright and warm and full of things, books stacked on every surface, a small writing desk covered in papers, 2 large windows with the curtains pulled fully open to let in what gray winter light there was, several maps pinned to the wall above the desk, and in the bed, sitting up against a great many pillows with a tray of unfinished breakfast beside him, was Lord Edmund Ashmore. He was thin. She noticed that first, because it was impossible not to. He was thin in the way that illness made a person thin, not in the gradual, unremarkable way of someone who simply did not eat enough, but in the sharp, insistent way of a body that was working very hard at something that was taking everything it had. But his eyes were alert and dark and bright, and his mouth was already shaped into something close to a smile before she had even finished crossing the room. "Miss Voss," he said, "I have been told you read books." She stopped just short of the chair that had been set near his bed. "Who told you that?" "My brother mentioned it. He said you looked at the shelves in the study the way people look at things they actually want." She glanced at the maps on his wall. "Your brother is more observant than he appears." Edmund laughed, a real one, short and genuine. He would not consider that a compliment, but it absolutely is. He gestured toward the chair. "Please sit down. I am terrible at looking up at people. My neck has opinions." She sat, up close. She could see that his color was poor, and that the effort of sitting up had cost him something he was pretending it had not. She decided not to pretend she had not noticed. "Are you in pain this morning?" she asked. He blinked, and she could see he had expected a different kind of opening. Some, he said, less than yesterday. More than I will admit to the doctor, because doctors react to honest answers with very boring solutions involving rest. And you prefer interesting solutions. I prefer any solution that involves continuing to be conscious and in conversation, he said. Rest is just a slow kind of disappearing. She looked at him steadily, he looked back. You are not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone who would be kind in that particular way that means afraid. Someone who would look at me and immediately start thinking about what to say at my funeral. He tilted his head. You are not doing that. I do not know you yet, she said. It would be premature. He smiled then, a full one that changed his whole face. Miss Voss, he said, I think I am going to like you quite a lot. She looked at his maps. One was of Scotland, one was of the Alps, one was of a coastline she did not immediately recognize. Have you been to all of these places? She asked. Some, he said. I put the others up to remind myself that the world is considerably larger than this room. There was something in the way he said it, not self-pity, nothing like that, but a plain and honest acknowledgement of a plain and honest thing that made her chest tighten for just a moment. She did not let it show. Which one have you not been to? She asked. He pointed to the coastline she had not recognized. The south of Portugal. I had a plan to go in the spring 2 years ago. He looked at it for a moment. The plans changed. She looked at the map. The coastline was irregular and wild-looking, all jagged edges and small inlets. What were you going to do there? Walk, he said. I was told the light is different there, that it comes from a different angle than it does here and makes ordinary things look remarkable. He looked back at her. I have always wanted to see ordinary things look remarkable. She thought about that. She thought about Thursday mornings and cold kitchens and white knuckles at windows. She thought about how much time she had spent in the past 3 years watching ordinary things look exactly as difficult as they were. That seems worth going for, she said. Yes, he said, it does. They talked for 2 hours. It did not feel like 2 hours. He asked her about her family, not in the cautious, careful way of someone trying to confirm her suitability, but in the direct and interested way of someone who genuinely wanted to know. She told him about Oliver and about her mother and about her father, who had been warm and generous and entirely unprepared for the actual demands of managing money. Edmund listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, He sounds like someone who would have been good company at a table. He was, she said. He was terrible at most practical things and wonderful at all the important ones. I think those are usually the same person, Edmund said. She looked at him. You sound like you know. My father was the opposite, Edmund said easily, excellent at practical things. Found the important ones extremely inconvenient. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact, the way he seemed to say most things. Kaylan takes after him in some ways, the practicality, but he got the important ones too, which my father never quite managed. It makes Kaylan considerably more exhausting to be around because he refuses to choose between the two. She thought of last night's dinner, the quiet, the too large table. Edmund is a good man, said to the fire rather than to her. Is that exhausting? She asked. Edmund looked at her with something that was almost amusement and almost something else. Only if you expect him to be one thing, he said. He is never one thing. He is always several things at once, and most of them are inconvenient. She looked at the Portugal map again. Lord Edmund, she said. Edmund, he said, please. Edmund, she looked back at him. Why me? There must have been other names on that list. He was quiet for a moment, which was the first time he had been quiet since she sat down. There were, he said, but the others I could tell from the responses to Mr. Holt's letter that they were being sent. Their families saw an opportunity and sent them the way you send a letter without asking the letter what it thought. He looked at her directly. Your mother's response said that you had read the letter yourself and would make your own decision. It was 3 sentences. Every other family sent 3 pages. He paused. I chose 3 sentences. She was very still for a moment. I am not going to pretend this is a normal arrangement, he said. It is not, but I want it to be an honest one. I want someone around who tells me true things, who is not afraid to be in the same room with the truth. I am going to die, Miss Voss, possibly soon, and I would rather spend whatever time I have with someone who knows that and is not breaking under the weight of it. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching. Outside the windows, a thin snow had begun to fall, the kind that was more cold than substance, drifting sideways in the wind. I have some conditions of my own, she said. I expected you would, he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. She listed them. They were 4 and they were clear, and they had nothing to do with money. He listened to each one and agreed to all of them without bargaining, which she had not expected, and which told her something about him that the 2 hours of conversation had already started to tell her, that he was the kind of person who meant what he said and said what he meant, which was rarer than it should have been and more valuable than most things. When she was done, he said, I have one condition of my own. Tell me. When I am having a bad day, he said, and there will be bad days, you do not have to pretend they are good, but you do not leave the house. You can walk away from me if you need to. You can go out to the gardens or down to the village or anywhere you like. But you do not leave the house for good without telling me first. She looked at him steadily. That is a fair condition, she said. Good. He settled back slightly against his pillows, and she could see the relief in it, the effort the morning had taken, and she understood that she needed to let him rest without making a thing of it. She stood, she picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. She looked at the Portugal map one more time. Edmund, she said. Yes. The light in the south of Portugal, she said. What did you read about it exactly? He smiled without opening his eyes. That it comes in low from the sea in the late afternoon, he said, and that it makes even the most unremarkable walls look gold. She looked at the jagged coastline. She thought about unremarkable things looking gold. I will give Mr. Holt my answer this afternoon, she said. She walked to the door, she opened it. She stood for one moment with her hand on the frame, looking at the thin snow falling past the bright windows. Then she walked out and went downstairs, and she wrote a letter to her mother, and the letter was 6 sentences, and every one of them was true. The ceremony took place on the 22nd of December, which meant that the oak trees on the drive had been standing bare for 3 weeks, and the ground had frozen so hard that the gravel on the path to the chapel crunched under their boots like old glass. Ilara had been at Ashmore Hall for 9 days by then. 9 days of learning the shape of the house, the rhythms of its people, the particular silence of its evenings. 9 days of morning visits to Edmund's room and long walks in the frozen gardens and dinners, where Kaelan sat across from her at the too long table and spoke in that careful, even voice about things that were not what either of them was actually thinking about. She had not written home after that first letter. She had not needed to. Her mother had sent a small parcel 2 days after Ilara arrived, a pale blue dress pressed and folded with tissue with a note that read, I thought you might want something of your own to wear if you decide to stay. No opinion, no persuasion. Just the dress and the note, and the quiet understanding that a mother had for a daughter she had raised to make her own choices. Ilara wore the dress on the morning of the 22nd. The chapel was a small building at the east end of the gardens, set apart from the main house by a stone wall and a path of winter-dead lavender. It seated perhaps 30 people. That morning there were 6. Ilara and Edmund Kaelan, Mr. Gerald Holt the solicitor, Greaves, and a woman named Mrs. Addie Marsh who had been Edmund's nurse since the illness progressed, and who wept quietly from the moment the door opened to the moment it closed, not from grief, but from what she would later tell Ilara was plain and uncomplicated gladness. The minister was a local man named Reverend Clark, who was elderly and kind, and who read the words of the ceremony with a steadiness that suggested he understood something the words did not quite say, that this was not an ordinary marriage, and that the people in the chapel knew it, and that the ceremony was still real for all of that, possibly more real. Edmund stood beside her in a dark coat that had been let out at the shoulders and taken in at the waist to fit his changed body. He was pale but composed, and he had done something careful with his hair, and she could tell the effort had cost him something, and also that he did not want her to notice this, so she did not notice it. He held himself very straight. When they arrived at the part of the ceremony where she was required to take his hand, his grip was firm and warm and entirely steady, and she squeezed back. She looked straight forward at Reverend Clark. In the edges of her vision she could see Kaelan standing at the back of the chapel, slightly apart from the others, his hands at his sides, perfectly still. The words were said. The register was signed. Ilara's name became, on paper and in law, Lady Edmund Ashmore, which was a stranger thing to read than she had expected, and she read it twice, sitting at the small table with the pen in her hand before she set the pen down. Edmund took her arm when they walked out of the chapel, partly out of courtesy, and partly because the path was icy and his balance on cold mornings was not always reliable. She supported him without making it look like supporting him, which was something she was already becoming fluent in. They came out into the flat, grey December light, and she felt the cold close around them both, and Edmund exhaled a long breath that turned white in the air. "Well," he said, "that is done." "It is," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gardens. Then he turned to look at her, and his eyes were very clear in the cold light. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly, which was the only way he ever seemed to want it answered. "I am a great many things," she said. "All right is somewhere in the middle of them." He smiled. "That is a perfectly reasonable place to be." They walked back along the path slowly, the frozen lavender brushing against their coats, the house growing in front of them, the smoke from its chimneys going straight up in the windless morning. Behind them, Kaelan walked alone. He had signed the wedding register as witness. She had seen his handwriting then for the first time, and it was the only thing about him that surprised her. It pressed hard into the paper as if the pen needed to be reminded who was in charge of it. The letters were precise, formed with intention, but they were heavy, insistent. It was not the handwriting of a man who took things lightly, even the things he appeared to take lightly. She had looked at his signature for a moment before she looked up, and found him already looking somewhere else. The midday meal that followed the ceremony was not quite a celebration and not quite an ordinary meal, and ended up being something in between, which Alara suspected was the best you could hope for. Cook had made an effort. There were more courses than usual, and they were each very good, and there was wine that was better than the wine Alara had noticed at previous dinners, which she appreciated. Mrs. Marsh had recovered from her gladness and was now solidly cheerful, talking about the gardens in spring with a proprietary warmth that made Alara feel, for the first time, that she might actually one day belong to the rhythms of this place. Mr. Holt had returned to London directly after the chapel, efficient and brief and not unkind. He had pressed Alara's hand and said, "His Grace has your interests fully documented, Lady Ashmore. You need not worry." She had thanked him and decided to verify this independently at her earliest opportunity, not because she thought he was lying, but because she had learned, in the past 3 years, that needing not to worry and being genuinely secure were different conditions, and she preferred to know the difference firsthand. Edmund ate more than she had expected him to, and it cheered her. She had been watching his appetite the way you watch weather, as an indicator of something larger, something harder to see directly. Today it was good, she marked this. Kaelan sat at the head of the table. He spoke when spoken to and offered the wine without prompting, and at one point said something quietly to Greaves about the fire in the drawing room that needed attention. And all of it was so entirely in keeping with the way he managed everything, efficiently, without apparent effort, as if the house simply functioned because he wanted it to, that she found herself watching him the way she found herself watching things that were interesting without wanting to be interesting. He caught her looking once. She did not look away because she was not embarrassed, and he did not look away because apparently he was not either. After a moment they both looked somewhere else, and that was that. After the meal Edmund was tired, as he was always tired after effort, and Mrs. Marsh took him upstairs with the calm authority of someone who had been doing this long enough to make it look like his own idea. Alara stood in the entrance hall and looked at the staircase for a moment after they disappeared, and she became aware, without looking, that Kaelan was standing in the doorway of the drawing room. "Come in if you would like," he said. "There is a fire." She went in. The drawing room was comfortable in the way that rooms in old houses are comfortable, not because everything was soft and pretty, though some of it was, but because everything had been used long enough to stop performing. The furniture sat where it sat because that was where it went. The fire had been lit because someone had decided it needed lighting and done it without waiting to be asked. The room felt like a thing that served its purpose without requiring acknowledgement. She sat in a chair near the fire. He sat across from her, not close, not far, in the same arrangement as the study, she noticed, that particular distance. He poured tea from the tray Greaves had brought without being asked, and handed her a cup, and she took it. They sat for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "You should know," he said at last, not looking at her but at the fire, "that this house has not had a woman in it who made decisions for some time. The staff may take a few days to understand your authority here." She looked at him. "My authority?" "You are Lady Ashmore now," he said. "Within the house, your decisions about its running are your own to make. I will not interfere with them." She thought about this. "That is generous." "It is practical," he said. I manage the estate, I have no patience for the interior and it has suffered for it. He looked at the fire. Edmund chose well. She was not sure if he meant the arrangement or her specifically, and she did not ask, because the answer would have been the same either way and she was not yet ready for it. He told me, she said instead, that you are several things at once. He glanced at her. Edmund talks a great deal. He does, she agreed. I find I do not mind. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the precondition of one, the arrangement of features that would become a smile if he let it. He did not let it. He has always been like that, he said. Since he was a boy, he finds silence uncomfortable. He has always filled it with the most direct thing in his mind. He paused. In most rooms it is considered somewhat impractical. In mine it is welcome, she said. He looked at her again. That particular quality of looking he had, not intrusive, not cold, but complete, as if looking were something he did thoroughly rather than casually. Good, he said. He has had very few rooms where it was welcome. The fire settled with a sound like a soft, heavy word. She looked around the drawing room at the things in it, the worn armchairs, the books stacked on the side table, a chess set on a small table near the window. A watercolor of the gardens on the wall that she suspected was old because the gardens in it looked different from the gardens outside. Has he always been in this house? She asked. Mostly, Kaelan said. He traveled for a few years before the illness. When he was well, he had plans to go further. He looked at the chess set. The illness stopped that. The south of Portugal, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, surprise or the suppression of it. He told you. Yes. He does not usually tell people that. Why not? Kaelan was quiet for a moment. Because most people, when they hear about the things a dying man wanted to do and cannot, begin to perform sadness in a way that makes it about them and not about him. He looked at the chess set. It irritates him. He is careful now about what he tells people. She thought about that. She thought about the way Edmund had told her about Portugal so easily, as if it were simply information, as if he trusted her not to make it into something that would burden him. He did not seem worried, she said. No, Kaelan said, and something in his voice was very quiet. He did not. She finished her tea. The fire was warm and the room was comfortable, and outside the windows the December afternoon was beginning its early collapse into dark. She set down her cup and looked at her hands for a moment, the ring on her left hand, which was simple and gold and fit properly, which she suspected was not an accident. I will look after him, she said. She said it simply, without performance, because it was what she meant, and she did not know another way to say things she meant. He was very still for a moment. I know, he said. 2 words. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire again. His jaw was set in that particular way of someone who was very carefully not saying the rest of what was in their head. She stood. Good night, Lord Ashmore. Good night, Lady Ashmore. She walked to the door. She was almost through it when she stopped and said without turning, Do you play chess? A brief silence. Yes, he said. Edmund mentioned you do, she said. He said you are methodical, that you plan very far ahead and rarely lose. She paused. He sounded impressed. He sounded, Kaelan said, with a dryness that she recognized as the closest he came to warmth, like someone who loses frequently and has decided to admire the person beating him instead of changing his strategy. She laughed before she could decide not to. It was a short sound, surprised out of her, and it filled the room for a moment before she controlled it. She looked back at him. He was looking at her with the most unguarded expression she had yet seen on his face, which was still not particularly unguarded, but was more than she had expected. Good night, she said again. Good night, he said again. She went upstairs. Her room was warm, and the bed had been turned down by someone who had not been asked to do it. There was a small vase of dried lavender on the bedside table that had not been there before, a plain, simple gesture that she suspected was Mrs. Marsh's work, and which she found unexpectedly affecting. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not reading, not sleeping, just sitting in the quiet of the house with her hands in her lap. She listened to its sounds, the fire in the grate, the wind outside, the distant creak of floorboards that could have been anyone or no one. She thought about the word she had used in her head earlier before she had let herself use it, home. She had not intended to use it. She was not sure it was accurate. But it had been there at the back of her thinking, persistent and inconvenient, and she had learned long ago that ignoring inconvenient things only made them louder. She was Lady Edmund Ashmore. She was in a house that was not hers. She was married to a man who was dying, who had maps of places he would not go on his wall and eyes like something bright kept in a careful space. She had spoken tonight to a man who pressed too hard when he wrote and kept a particular distance, and said "I know" in a voice that meant more than 2 words usually meant. She lay down on the bed without changing out of the pale blue dress. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, "I am several things at once." She thought, "All right is somewhere in the middle of them." Outside, the December night settled over Ashmore Hall with its full weight, and the oak trees on the drive stood perfectly still in the windless cold, and somewhere in the house a fire went on burning without being asked. January came in the way January always does after a December that asked too much of everyone, quietly, like a person who knows they are going to be difficult and prefers not to announce it. The first week brought more snow, the real kind, heavy and silent and serious, that filled in the tracks on the drive and built up along the sills of Edmund's east-facing windows, and made the world outside them look like something drawn in pencil rather than lived in. Inside, the house reorganized itself around winter. Fires were lit earlier in the day. Greaves had a word with the kitchen about warming foods, and the result was that something hot was always available between meals, which Alara appreciated more than she had expected to. The days became defined by their rhythms. Morning with Edmund, afternoons that were her own, evenings at the long dinner table. She was beginning to know the sounds of each part of the day as well as she had once known the sounds of her family's house, which was the kind of knowing that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. Edmund improved slightly in January, which surprised both the doctors and him. It was not a recovery, nothing about the situation admitted of that word, but there were days when the coughing was less, and the color in his face was better, and he ate with something approaching enthusiasm rather than obligation. On those days he was unstoppable. He talked about books he had read and ones he wanted to read. He asked Alara questions about the village she had walked to twice now, about the people she had met there, about the publican who had given her directions to the post office, and the woman outside the bakery who had looked at her with the careful, not unfriendly curiosity of someone putting together a picture. He wanted to know everything that was happening in the world outside his room, and he received each piece of information with such genuine pleasure that she found herself, on walks, noticing things she would normally have walked past, because she knew she would be telling Edmund about them. She had not expected this. She had expected, coming into the arrangement, to be kind. She had expected to perform company for a man who was running out of it. She had not expected to be interested. She had not expected that the company would run in both directions. One morning in the second week of January, she arrived at Edmund's room with a library book she had found on the shelves downstairs, a collection of essays about natural history, written by a man who found even the most ordinary creatures remarkable, and she found him in the middle of a letter, his pen moving fast across the paper with the energy of someone with more to say than time allows. He looked up. "Give me 3 minutes," he said without stopping writing. She sat down in the chair that was now, by default, her chair. She looked at the Portugal map while he finished. It had been joined, she noticed, by a new map she had not seen before, a detailed map of the coastline of Greece, pinned carefully between Scotland and the Alps. "That is new," she said, when he finally put his pen down. "It arrived last week," he said. He did not look at it. He looked at her and she understood that he was watching for her reaction. "When did you add it?" she asked. "The day after the wedding," he said. She looked at the Greek coastline, all those bays and peninsulas, the islands scattered offshore like something broken and not mended. "Why?" He leaned back against his pillows with the particular ease of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. "Because I have decided," he said, "that the only rational response to a shortened horizon is a longer list." She looked at him. "That is either very wise or very painful." "Almost certainly both," he said. "Things that are worth doing usually are." She thought about Thursday mornings and cold kitchens. She thought about the very long list she had made, 3 years ago, of all the things she was going to do when the situation improved, and the way the list had never quite disappeared even when she had stopped looking at it. "Who is the letter to?" she asked. "A man I know in Edinburgh," Edmund said. "He has a friend who has been to Greece, and I want a reliable account of the ferry schedule from Brindisi." He picked up the letter and looked at it with satisfaction. "I have been working on the logistics for a possible trip in March." She looked at him very carefully. He looked back at her with an expression that was entirely aware and entirely unrepentant. "Edmund," she said. "Yes, the doctors have said." "The doctors," he said, "have said several things, many of which have already proven incorrect. I am therefore in the business of evaluating their predictions on a case-by-case basis." He folded the letter with precision. "I am not planning to tell them about Greece until it becomes relevant." She held his gaze. "And Kaylan?" Edmund smiled. "Kaylan already knows," he said. "He said it was inadvisable and then spent half an hour asking me about the most comfortable routes from the port to the interior." She stared at him. He looked deeply pleased with himself. "My brother," he said, "is an exceptionally practical man with a very impractical heart. Once he decides something is going to happen, he makes it as safe as possible. It is one of his most endearing qualities." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the chess set in the drawing room. She thought about Kaylan's handwriting pressing hard into the page. "He did not mention it at dinner," she said. "No," Edmund said, "he would not. He is still working through the part where he thinks it is a bad idea." "Is it a bad idea?" Edmund looked at the Greece map. He was quiet for a moment, which was still unusual enough to mean something. "Probably," he said, "but I have been very good at not doing things I should not do for 2 years now, and I am becoming quite bad at it." He looked back at her. "I want to see the light on the water in Corfu before I stop being in a position to want things." "I think that is a reasonable thing to want." The room was very still for a moment. Outside, the snow was falling again, the heavy kind, and the light through the windows was white and flat and even. "When you read to me today," he said, changing registers so smoothly she barely registered it, "do not start from the beginning of the essay. Skip to the one about starlings. I have been thinking about starlings." She opened the book. She found the essay. She read to him for an hour, and he listened with his eyes closed and a small expression of concentration that was very nearly peace. And outside the window the snow came down in that serious, businesslike way that means it has no intention of stopping soon. She read about starlings moving together in patterns that had no leader and no plan, only each bird responding to the nearest bird, and the result of all those small local decisions being something that looked, from a distance, like intention. When she finished the essay, she looked up. Edmund's eyes were still closed. "Are you asleep?" she asked. "No," he said without opening them. "I am thinking about the murmuration." "What about it?" "That it has no one in charge," he said, "and it is still the most beautiful thing most people ever see." She thought about that. "What are you saying?" He opened his eyes and looked at her with that expression she was coming to know, the one that was direct and layered at the same time, that said more than one thing simultaneously. "Nothing yet," he said. "I am still thinking about it." She closed the book. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, in a different voice, the one he used for true things, "Do you like it here?" She considered the question as honestly as it deserved. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to." "What did you expect?" "Something colder," she said, "something more managed, a house where everything was done correctly and nothing was felt." He looked at the ceiling. "That was this house for a long time," he said. "After our father died, Kaylan runs things very well. He is very competent at the management of large, complicated things." He paused. "He is less competent at smaller things, personal things." "He seems to manage well enough," she said carefully. "He manages," Edmund agreed, "but managing and thriving are different countries." He turned his head to look at her. "He does not have anyone to talk to, Alara. He has not for a long time. People here speak to him because he is the Duke, or because they need something from the estate, or because they are responsible to him in some way. No one speaks to him as a person." She thought of two people at opposite ends of a very long table. "He speaks to me." Edmund looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "he does." Something in his tone suggested that this was not a small thing. She looked at the new Greek map on the wall. "You said you chose me because of a 3-sentence letter." "That is true." "Was that the only reason?" He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has known exactly what they were doing all along. "There may have been additional reasoning," he said. "I am a man with a great deal of time to think. I become very thorough." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back entirely without apology. She thought about murmurations. She thought about the way they worked, each bird responding to the nearest bird, all those small local decisions adding up to a pattern that looked, from a distance, like someone had planned it. "Edmund," she said. "Yes, you are going to try to be matchmaker, aren't you?" He looked at the ceiling again with the expression of a man contemplating a deeply interesting patch of plaster. "I would not use that word," he said. "I would say I am providing conditions." "For what?" "For whatever happens," he said, "to happen." She stared at him. He was entirely peaceful. "You are the most maddening person," she said. "My nurse says the same thing every single morning," he said pleasantly. "I take it as a high compliment." She stood up. She gathered her things. She went to the door and stopped and turned back. "Edmund," she said. "Yes, when you see the light on the water in Corfu," she said, "you are going to write me a very long letter about it." He looked at her. Something moved in his face, something real and genuine and not covered by anything. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will." She went out and closed the door and stood in the corridor for a moment, alone in the midday quiet of the house, listening to it breathe. Somewhere downstairs a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the hall below her. She recognized the weight of them, not Greaves, not Mrs. Marsh, not any of the household staff. She looked down over the landing. Kalen was crossing the entrance hall with his coat still on, which meant he had just come in from outside, which meant he had been out in the estate all morning the way he always was, managing the large, complicated things he managed. He paused at the base of the stairs as if he had heard something. He looked up. She was looking down. He had snow on the shoulders of his coat, just a little, the last of it, already melting in the warmth of the house. His face was cold, sharp and still, and looking up at her with that particular complete quality, as if looking were something he did with his full attention. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "How is he today?" "He is planning a trip to Greece," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I know." He said, "You spent half an hour on the routes." A pause. "The ferry from Brindisi is not reliable in March," he said. "We were discussing alternatives." She looked at him. The snow on his coat was mostly gone now. "You are going with him." He looked at her steadily. Someone has to make sure he does not do something inadvisable without a plan. She thought about impractical hearts in very practical men. She thought about a chess player who planned very far ahead and rarely lost. She thought about all the small local decisions that add up to a pattern that looks, from a distance, like someone had planned it. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went back to her room. She sat at the small writing desk and she wrote another letter to her mother, and this one was longer than 6 sentences, and the last line said, "I am beginning to understand the shape of this place. I think that means I am staying." She posted it the next morning. She did not ask herself why she had used the word staying rather than the word staying until Edmund dies. She noticed the difference. She let it sit without explanation, the way Edmund let the murmuration move without asking who was in charge. Outside, January went on being January, gray and cold and serious, and the oak trees on the drive stood in the snow as if they had always been there and always intended to be. The second private meeting between Alara and Kaylan happened on a Tuesday in late January and was nothing like the first one. The first had been arranged, formal. There had been a time and a place and a reason, and both of them had arrived at it knowing what it was supposed to be. The second one was nothing like that. It simply happened the way things happen in houses where people live in close proximity, not planned, not announced, just there. She had been in the library. The library at Ashmore Hall was a room she had been discovering slowly, the way you discover a complicated piece of music by listening to it multiple times before you hear everything in it. It was a large room on the ground floor, with 2 tall windows that let in the pale afternoon light and walls of shelves that went from floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and a rolling ladder on a brass track that she had used on precisely 4 occasions and nearly fallen off on 2 of them. The books were old and new and in between, and they were organized in a way that suggested someone had a system, but the system had been interrupted multiple times by someone else with a different system. So the overall effect was of order and disorder coexisting in a state of permanent, comfortable negotiation. She had been there for perhaps an hour and a half, sitting in the low chair near the left window with a book of natural history she had been working through since finding it 2 weeks ago. The afternoon light was very good at this time of day. The fire had been lit. She had a cup of tea she had stopped being aware of. The door opened. She did not look up immediately, because it was often Greaves or one of the household, and she had reached a chapter about tidal patterns that required her full attention. Lady Ashmore. She looked up. Kaylan stood just inside the door with a folder of papers under one arm. He had not expected her to be here. She could see that from the slight adjustment in his expression, the brief recalibration. He was wearing dark work clothes rather than the formal things he wore at dinner, and there was ink on the second finger of his right hand, which she had begun to notice appeared frequently, which told her he wrote a great deal by hand even though there were clerks for that sort of thing. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not know you were in here." "Is the library yours on Tuesday afternoons?" she asked. Something moved in his face. "No," he said. "I came to return these." He held up the folder. "There is a shelf in the east section that I need." She moved her feet from the ottoman so he could reach the ladder. He came across the room without making an event of it, pulled the ladder to the right point on the track, went up, and spent a moment examining the upper shelf. She watched him because there was no particular reason not to. He found what he was looking for and came back down, and then, instead of leaving, he stood with the folder under his arm and looked at the chair across from hers, the one she had come to think of as the chair that waited to be used. "Sit down," she said, "unless you have somewhere to be." He sat down. He did not open the folder. He set it on the side table and looked at the fire. She went back to her title chapter. He did not speak. The fire made its small domestic sounds. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning its early winter retreat from the windows. This lasted perhaps 10 minutes, which was longer than she had expected it to last. Then he said, "May I ask you something?" "Yes," she said without looking up. "What are you like when you are at home?" She looked up. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which made the question easier to answer honestly. "Efficient," she said. "Practical. I manage things." She paused. "I am not very good at sitting still unless I have something to read." "And when you are not managing things?" She thought about this. "I walk," she said. "I write letters. I argue with my brother about whether the books we read are any good. I cook when there is something worth cooking." She looked back at her book. "I am not very interesting when I am at home." "I doubt that," he said, still looking at the fire. She glanced at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the things you have just described are not the things of someone who is uninteresting," he said. "They are the things of someone who is self-sufficient, which is a different and considerably rarer thing." She looked at him more directly now. He had still not looked at her. "You say that as if self-sufficiency is something you have personal experience of." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I manage a large estate," he said. "I manage tenants and accounts and staff and legal matters and 200 years of family complications. I have been doing this since I was 25. "How old are you now?" 33. "That is 8 years. "Yes. "Who manages you?" she asked. He looked at her then, directly, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was not the controlled, careful thing she was accustomed to seeing there. It was there and then it was gone, and he looked back at the fire. "That," he said, "is an excellent question." She closed her book, not because she had decided to close it, but because the conversation had reached a place where a closed book was more honest than an open one. "I spoke with Edmund this morning," Kaylan said, after a pause. "He has asked Mrs. Marsh to look into whether his condition would permit travel in March under the right conditions." "He told me about Greece," she said. "I know, he tells you things in the same order he tells me them, which I find interesting." He looked at the fire. "He also told you about his letters to Edinburgh." "He did." "He did not tell me he was going to tell you," Kaylan said. "Which means he has decided you are in the same category of person as I am, as far as he is concerned." She considered this. "What category is that?" "Someone he trusts to receive true information, and not manage him into a different decision based on it." She was quiet for a moment. "He made the right choice about that," she said. "Yes," Kaylan said, "he did." A pause. Outside, the last of the afternoon light left the windows, and the room became warm and firelit and enclosed, the kind of room that encourages directness. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. He looked at her. "Not the estate," she said, "and not Edmund's health, something that does not fit into either of those categories." He waited. She looked at the fire the way he often did. It was a useful thing to look at, she had decided. It moved, which kept the eyes occupied so the mind could say things more honestly. You came to me before the wedding with a list of expectations, she said. They were clear and I understood them. Since then you have not restated them or reminded me of them or checked whether I was following them. No, he agreed. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because you followed them before I could remind you, he said, and because they were your decisions to make, not instructions to receive. She looked at him. You said them as instructions. I said them as a framework, he said. There is a difference. What is the difference? He looked at her steadily. Instructions assume compliance, he said. A framework assumes that the person inside it is capable of making better decisions than the framework itself anticipates. He paused. I expect that is true of you. She held his gaze for a moment. You revised one of them, she said. That night, you revised the condition about Edmund's visiting hours when I challenged it. Yes. Without arguing. You had a better reason than I had for the original condition, he said. Arguing would have been a waste of time. She thought about this. She thought about the 3 years of managing things alone, of being in rooms where she had better reasons and no one who wanted to hear them. I find that unusual, she said. I find it practical, he said. Most men find it uncomfortable. Most men, he said without inflection, are not running something they want to run well. The fire settled. She looked at his hands, the ink on the second finger, the long, deliberate fingers of someone who spent a great deal of time writing things down. She looked at the folder on the side table. What is in there? She asked. Estate accounts for February, he said. I was going to work on them in here because the study is cold and I had not wanted to wait for the fire to build. Then work on them, she said. He looked at her. You do not mind? I am reading, she said. Work on your accounts. He picked up the folder. He opened it. He worked. She read. The fire burned. The room was very quiet. Outside it had begun to snow again, the small, determined kind that would go on all night. This lasted for quite some time. An hour, perhaps more. It was not awkward. It was the opposite of awkward. It was the specific kind of comfortable that requires two people who do not need to fill space with words in order to justify their presence in the same room. Greaves brought lamps at some point without being asked, and set them in the right places and left again, and neither of them commented on it. Eventually she put her book down and looked at him, and he was working through the accounts with his pen moving in that heavy, deliberate way, and there was a concentration about him that was not tense but was wholly occupied, the full presence of a person who does not do things by halves. Kaylan, she said. He looked up. Do you ever talk about the things that are not the estate and not Edmund? He held her gaze, a long pause, not evasive. He was thinking. She had learned to recognize the difference. Less than I used to, he said. There are fewer people who want to hear them. I want to hear them, she said. Something in his face shifted with a slowness that was not quite reluctance and not quite surprise. It was more like the way a window shifts when someone opens it for the first time in a long season, not dramatic, but significant, because the air that comes through is different from the air that was there before. That is a large invitation, he said. It is a small sentence, she said, which means it can be accepted in stages. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back down at his accounts. I used to read more than I do now, he said, not looking up. Before the estate took everything, I used to spend entire days in this room. What did you read? History mainly, he said. Not the kind that lists kings and wars. The kind that follows ordinary people through periods of large change and asks what they decided to do each morning when they woke up. She thought about that. She thought about ordinary things looking remarkable. Why that kind? Because the kings and wars are the same in every period, he said. But what people decided to do each morning, that changes. That is where the actual life is. She picked up her book again. She opened it to the tidal pattern chapter. She did not start reading. She sat with his words for a moment, feeling the shape of them. I think, she said, that is the most you have said to me at once about something that is not practical. Yes, he said, looking back down at his numbers, it probably is. It was well worth waiting for, she said. She could not see his face. She heard, very quietly, the sound of his pen stopping on the page for just a moment before it resumed. She read, he worked. The snow went on coming down outside, patient and persistent, covering the frozen drive and the bare gardens and the stone chapel where they had stood 3 weeks ago in a ceremony that had been real precisely because it did not pretend to be something it was not. At dinner, they did not mention the library, but she noticed that he sat a fraction closer to her end of the long table than usual, and she noticed that the distance between them, without either of them remarking on it, had quietly changed. By February, Edmund had become the most deliberate person Alara had ever met. She had thought at first that this was simply his character, the natural quality of someone who had always been curious, always engaged, always filling the space around him with questions and conversation and ideas that arrived with no introduction and departed without apology. She had thought it was just the way he was built. She understood, by February, that she had been partly right and partly very wrong. The curiosity was genuine and always had been. But the deliberateness, the intentional quality of every morning, every question, every arrangement he made, that was something he had chosen. It was not natural ease. It was a decision he made every day, and she had come to recognize the precise moment in each morning when he made it. It happened quietly. Mrs. Marsh would have gone, the tray would be set. Edmund would look at the window for a moment, not long, never long, and then something in his face would settle and he would look at whatever book or letter or map was in front of him and he would begin. That settling was the decision. She saw it now the way you see once you have learned to look, the moment a bird decides to fly. She had stopped pretending she did not see it. He knew she saw it. Neither of them said anything about it, because they did not need to and because some things between them had reached the stage of being understood without requiring language. On a Tuesday morning in the first week of February, Edmund had something new on his desk when she arrived. Not a map this time. A small leather notebook, the kind for notes and quick thoughts, already half filled with Edmund's writing. It was open to a page that had the word questions at the top and then a list written quickly, the ink a little uneven, some words crossed out and rewritten. She sat down and looked at it, because he had clearly left it open where she could see it, which meant he wanted her to. "Questions for whom?" she asked. "For you," he said. "I have been collecting them." She looked at the list. The questions were not what she had expected. They were not the questions people asked when they were being polite or filling silence. They were the questions people asked when they had been paying attention. The third one was, what did you decide not to do with your life and do you regret it? The sixth one was, when you are angry, what does it feel like before you know you are angry? The ninth one at the bottom was, what would you want said about you if you were not in the room? She looked up from the list. Edmund was watching her with the expression he used for things he was genuinely uncertain about, which was different from his usual expression of comfortable directness. "You do not have to answer them," he said. "I know," she said. "I will anyway." She looked at the list again, not all at once. "No," he agreed. "One at a time is better. I wrote them over 3 weeks. They are better approached slowly." She pointed to number 3. "This one first," she said. "What did you decide not to do with your life?" He nodded. She looked at the window. The February morning was thin and pale and clear, the first clear day in some time, and the gardens below were still under snow, but the sky above them was the particular blue that only appeared on cold days when the air was absolutely clean. "I decided not to marry for position," she said. "I decided not to marry anyone whose opinion of me I did not respect, regardless of what they could offer. I decided not to become the kind of person who pretends things are fine when they are not, even when pretending is easier." She paused. "I have decided not to let the fact of not having money make me small." Edmund was very still. "Do I regret it?" she said. "No," she looked back at him. "The deciding is the thing I like best about myself. I would not give it up for any of the things it has cost me." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very bright. "I wrote question 9, he said, "because I wanted to know how you think of yourself when no one is making you perform a role." And he said, "I think I just got the answer." She looked at the notebook. "What about your list?" she said. "What did you decide not to do?" He smiled, but it was a quiet smile, private in a way his smiles usually were not. "I decided not to pretend the illness is not what it is," he said. "I decided not to be angry at Kaylin for managing me when I am difficult. I decided not to die in this room without having been honest with the people I care about." She looked at him. "I decided," he said, not to leave without doing at least a few things that mattered. She did not say anything for a moment. The clear blue sky was very still outside the window. Somewhere on the estate a bird was singing, one of the winter birds, a small, determined sound in the cold air. "You are doing them," she said. "I am trying," he said. "Some days better than others." She reached across and closed the notebook gently. "Save the rest of the questions," she said. "I intend to answer all 9. He looked at her steadily. "You might not like number 6, he said. "When I am angry, what does it feel like before I know I am angry?" she said. "I become very organized. I start tidying things that do not need tidying. I make lists that are more detailed than necessary. I become, briefly, the most efficient person in any room." He stared at her. "I know," she said. "It is a very inconvenient tell." He laughed then, the real laugh, the short and genuine one that she had become, she realized, very attached to. She had not noticed this attachment building. It had built the way the library comfort had built, quietly, without announcement, in the daily accumulation of mornings that were not what she had expected and were better for it. That afternoon, Kaelan came to Edmund's room. He did not usually come in the mornings because his estate work ran through until the early afternoon. But he came in the afternoons when he could, and Alara had developed the habit of staying when he arrived, because Edmund was more animated when Kaelan was present, and also because she had admitted this only to herself, and only recently, she found the afternoons more interesting when Kaelan was in the room. He arrived at just past 2, in the heavy wool coat he wore outside, still cold from the air, and he sat in the third chair that had appeared in Edmund's room at some point in early January without anyone remarking on its arrival or placement. Greaves had simply put it there one day. It had stayed. Edmund was in the middle of explaining his current theory about the relationship between ocean currents and the migratory patterns of certain birds, based on the natural history essays he had been reading with Alara's help. He was explaining this with the focused energy of someone who had been working something out, and was now at the stage where the working out had reached a conclusion worth saying aloud. Kaelan listened. He sat with his coat still on and his hands in his lap, and he listened the way he did everything, with complete unself-conscious attention. He did not check the time. He did not manage Edmund toward a practical point. He simply listened to his brother talk about ocean currents and birds, and his face was very open in a way it was not at dinner or in the library or anywhere that was not this room. She watched this. She noted it the way she noted the morning settling decision in Edmund's face, as something that told her something true about a person. When Edmund finished, Kaelan said, "The current off the southern tip of Portugal runs counter to the one further north, which would account for the concentration you are describing in the winter months." Edmund pointed at him. "That is exactly what I thought," he said. "I needed someone to confirm the geography." "You could have looked at a map," Kaelan said. "I could have," Edmund agreed, "but then I would not have had a reason to tell you about it, and watching you arrive at a conclusion is considerably more satisfying than reading one." Kaelan looked at him with the expression he used for Edmund, which was different from every other expression he had. It was not soft, exactly. It was more like anchored, like the careful, steady way you hold something that matters. "Portugal again," Alara said. Both of them looked at her. "The current," she said, "and Edmund's maps, everything points to Portugal." Edmund looked at her with delight. "You see it too." "I think," she said, "the world is trying to tell you something." Edmund looked at his brother. Kaelan looked at the window. Then he looked back at Edmund and said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely decided, "The roads from Lisbon north are better in late April than March. I have been looking into it." Edmund looked at him with an expression that was, for a moment, naked and complete before he put his usual ease back over it. He said, "April, then." Kaelan nodded once. Alara looked at her hands. She thought about impractical hearts. She thought about the chess player who planned very far ahead. She thought about what it meant to help someone do something inadvisable, not because you thought it was wise, but because the alternative, watching them stay still, was something you would not accept. She said, without planning to, "I want to come." Both of them looked at her. She looked at Edmund. "If you are going to Portugal in April," she said, "I want to come." Edmund's face was something she did not have a word for. He looked at Kaelan. Kaelan looked at her, and the expression on his face was the complicated one, the layered one, the one she had started to think of as the truest version of his face because it was the one that appeared when he was not managing himself. "All right," he said. "All right," Edmund said. She looked back at the window. The thin February light was there, clear and cold and clean, and somewhere outside a bird was still singing in the cold air, that small, determined sound, as if it intended to be heard by the whole of winter. She did not tell either of them that she had agreed to the arrangement in December because she needed the money, and that by February the money had become the least true thing about why she was in this house. She did not say this because it was the kind of thing that is better understood than said. But she thought it, sitting in Edmund's third chair in the February afternoon, with both Ashmore brothers in the same room as her, and the map of Portugal on the wall above the desk, and the clear winter sky through the window, and all the ordinary things around her looking, in that particular cold light, a little bit gold. March came in on a Wednesday, and Edmund did not. That was how Ilara would remember it later, not the date, not the weather, not the particular arrangement of the morning, but the specific way the world kept happening while Edmund lay in his room fighting the hardest few weeks she had yet seen, and the contrast between the world continuing and him struggling through. It was the thing she held in her memory like a stone you carry in a pocket, small and constant and surprisingly heavy. The doctors had said it might come. They had used careful language, a possible deterioration, a challenge to the lungs, a period of increased difficulty, and she had translated this into ordinary words and understood that what they were describing was a significant worsening, and that the timeline they had given in December was now compressing. She understood this, and she did what she had always done with difficult and certain things. She organized herself around them. She was with Edmund every morning and most afternoons. She read to him when his eyes were too tired for print. She sat with him when he did not want to be talked at. She brought the notebook of questions when he was well enough, and they worked through it slowly, and she answered number 6 again with more honesty than the first time because by March she trusted him with a more complete version of the truth. She was also, on the bad days, simply present. She had learned that presence was its own kind of thing, not passive, not management, but an active and conscious decision to be there in the room with the person who was in the room, not somewhere else in her mind or her worry. Edmund knew the difference. He had told her once in January that the hardest part of being ill was not the physical part, but the way it made the people around you go somewhere else in their heads while their bodies stayed in your room, so that you were, in a way, alone twice. She had remembered this, and she did not go elsewhere. When she was there, she was there. The household had changed in March. It was not dramatic, the way changes in novels were dramatic. There were no dark corridors or sudden revelations in moonlit rooms. It was quieter than that. The fires were banked higher. Mrs. Marsh's hours extended. Greaves moved through the house with a quieter, more watchful quality. The staff, most of whom had been at Ashmore Hall for years and known Edmund since he was young, carried themselves with the particular composure of people who understand that composure is a form of love. And Caelan. She had not known before March what Caelan was when his control was being genuinely tested. She had seen him controlled and efficient and careful. She had seen him in the library, more open than he probably intended. She had seen him in Edmund's room on afternoons with the anchored, attentive face. She had not seen this. He was in Edmund's room every day in March for hours at a time, and in those hours something shifted in him that she could only describe as an unwilling yielding, not of his composure because his composure held, but of the distance he usually kept between himself and what was happening. He sat close to Edmund's bed. He did not sit across the room in the third chair. He sat close on the edge of it, with his elbows on his knees in a posture she had never seen him use anywhere else, and he talked to Edmund in a different voice than any other voice she had heard him use, low and quiet and continuous, as if he was keeping something going with sound. She saw this because she was there, but she saw it from the corners of her attention, the way you see a thing that is not meant for you to see but that you cannot help seeing because you are human and present and paying attention. She did not make a thing of it. She did not look directly at it. She received it in the peripheral way of someone who respects the private quality of a thing while being unable not to know it is there. One evening in the second week of March she went downstairs at 10 at night because she could not sleep, and the house was quiet in the particular airless way it was quiet on bad days, and she went to the kitchen because the kitchen at night was the only room in the house that felt entirely practical, which was what she needed. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight with her hands around the cup, and she looked at the wall opposite, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 weeks, to be aware of how much she was holding. It was considerable. She had not cried. She was not going to cry at the kitchen table at 10 in the evening because crying required a kind of unstructured private collapse that she was currently not able to afford. But she sat with the weight of it, the real weight, not the managed version, and let it be what it was for a few minutes. Edmund, the maps he would not use, the questions in the notebook that they had not finished. The light in Portugal that he had described to her in January on a morning when the world had still felt like a place with space in it for plans. She heard a footstep in the doorway. She looked up. Kaylan stood in the kitchen doorway. He had his coat on, which meant she had learned that he had been outside, and his hair was slightly disordered in a way she had not seen before, and his face was without the usual management. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I could not sleep," she said. "No," he said. He came into the kitchen. He pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down without asking, which she noted because he usually asked. He put his coat on the chair beside him. He looked at her cup. He got up, went to the stove, made himself tea, and came back, all of this without a word. He sat down, he looked at the table. "He was better this evening," she said. "Yes," Kaylan said. "He ate more. He finished the essay about the starlings. He told me," he looked at his cup, "he said you laughed at the ending." "I did," she said. "The ending is funny and also not funny. It does that thing where it says something real inside something light, and you do not realize until afterward." Kaylan looked at her. "Edmund does that," he said. "I know," she said. "I think the essay reminded him of himself." He was very still for a moment, then he said quietly, "It did." She looked at the lamp on the table, the yellow circle of it on the wood, the way it made the kitchen feel contained and simple and apart from everything else in the dark house. "Kaylan," she said. He looked at her. "When did you know he was actually ill?" she said. "Not the beginning. The moment you knew it was the kind of illness that does not reverse." He was quiet for a long moment. She did not hurry him. He was a person who needed time with true questions. "October of the year before last," he said. "There was a morning when he came down to breakfast and looked exactly like himself, entirely himself, and I thought it was turning. I thought he was going to be all right." He looked at his cup. "And then he tried to carry his own tray to the table and he could not manage the stairs without stopping twice." She listened. "I went outside afterward," he said. "Into the gardens. I walked to the wall at the far end and I stood there for some time." He paused. "That was when I knew." She looked at him. The lamp made the kitchen small and warm and entirely separate from the March night outside. "I am sorry," she said. He looked at her, just 2 words, direct and simple, and she meant them exactly the way they sounded, without performance or qualification. He looked at her as if he was receiving something he had not known he was waiting to receive. "I have not told anyone that," he said. "The morning with the tray." "I know," she said. She did not explain how she knew, she simply knew. He looked at the table. "He chose you very well," he said. "He told me the same thing about you," she said. "He said you were several things at once and that most of them were inconvenient." Something crossed his face, the precondition of a smile, allowed a little further than usual. "He is right," he said. "He usually is," she said. They sat in the kitchen for a long time. They finished their tea. They did not fill the silence because the silence had things in it that would have been diminished by conversation. Eventually she stood and took the cups to the counter and rinsed them, and he stood and put his coat back on. And at the door she said good night, and he said good night, and he went up the stairs and she followed a few minutes later, and the kitchen was empty and quiet behind them with the lamp still burning. She stood in her room for a moment before getting into bed. She looked at the dark window. She thought about the wall at the far end of the gardens where Kaylan had stood in October of the year before last, and the morning with the tray, and the moment when you walk outside to know something alone before you have to carry it. She thought, there are people who know what costs them the most by how carefully they never mention it. She thought, I am one of those people. She thought, so is he. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, and outside the window March went on being March, cold and stubborn and necessary, the kind of month that exists so that April can happen. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was not elsewhere. She was entirely in the room, entirely in the house, entirely in the dark of it with all the things it held, which were difficult and complicated, and she understood, in a way she could not have predicted in December when she had read a letter sealed in dark blue wax at a kitchen table on a Thursday morning, exactly where she wanted to be. Edmund died on the 14th of April, on a morning with very good light. He had said once in January that he hoped for good light at the end, and Alara had not known then how to think about that. It had seemed too specific to be taken entirely literally, too particular to be only metaphor. But the morning of the 14th was exactly as he had said, clear and still, with a high pale sky and the particular April light that came into his east-facing windows sideways and low, and turned everything in the room a color between gold and white. She was with him, Mrs. Marsh was with him, Kaelan was on the other side of the bed. It was very quiet, the house was very still. The birds outside were singing the morning songs, the ones that went on regardless, and the gardens below the window were beginning, finally, to be green. Edmund had spoken a little in the hour before, not much, he had been very tired, but a little. He had said at some point, looking at the ceiling, "The light really is different in April." Alara had looked at the window and understood what he meant and said yes. He had looked at Kaelan for a long moment, and Kaelan had held his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already say. At 10 minutes past 7, very quietly, Edmund was gone. The house received it, that was the only way she could think of it. The house received it the way a house receives everything, without announcement, without drama, simply by continuing, and what had been true in the moment before became true in the moment after, and the birds went on singing, and the April light went on coming through the windows, and everything was exactly the same and entirely different. Mrs. Marsh wept. Alara put her arm around her and held her for a moment. Then she looked at Kaelan. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, very still, and she could see from the set of his shoulders exactly what it was costing him to be standing upright at that moment, and she knew, with the same quiet certainty with which she had known most of the true things about this house, that he did not want to be seen in this moment. She said to Mrs. Marsh gently, "Will you ask Greaves to come?" And Mrs. Marsh went, and the room was empty except for the two of them and the window and the April morning. She went to stand beside him, not close, just near. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and she had learned from him that silence was a form of respect. After a long time he said, without turning, he wanted good light. He had it, she said. Another long silence. He wanted Portugal, he said. She looked at the gardens, green now, the first green of the year. He had the plan for it, she said. He had the maps, he had the ferry schedules, he had April. She paused. He chose April on purpose. He turned then and looked at her, and his face was not composed. It was not managed. It was the real face, the one underneath all the others, and she looked at it without looking away because he needed someone to look at it without looking away. He said very quietly, "Thank you for being here." She looked at him. "Where else would I be?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the window, and they stood there together in the April morning with the birds outside and the new green gardens. And the light in the room was exactly as Edmund had said, remarkable, the kind that makes ordinary things look like something more than what they are. The week after Edmund was buried felt to Alara like a week in a country she did not speak the language of. She knew the shapes of the days, she was entirely familiar with the house and its rhythms, but everything was slightly foreign, as if the house itself was adjusting to what it now was, to the absence at its center. She wrote to her mother, she wrote to Oliver, she walked in the gardens every morning because the gardens were the easiest place to be honest, in the open air without walls. She continued the small management things she had been doing for months. She had been running much of the interior of the house since February, gradually and without any formal discussion, simply because she was there and competent, and Kaelan had meant what he said about her authority. She continued these things because continuing them was the most honest tribute she knew how to pay to a place that had made a home of her. Kaelan worked. He worked with the focused, driven intensity of a man who had found something reliable in the doing of necessary things, and she understood this because she used it herself, and she did not try to draw him out of it. She left him to his estate and his accounts, and his pen pressing too hard on the page, because she knew that the doing was its own kind of through the worst. Mr. Holt came at the end of the second week. He came with a briefcase and a careful face, and asked if they could sit in the study at 2 in the afternoon, and she said yes, and she and Kaelan sat across from each other on the 2 chairs that faced Holt's position at the desk, and they listened. The estate terms they already knew. What they had not known, what no one had told them, because Edmund had specifically asked that it not be shared in advance, was the clause in Edmund's private will regarding Alara's inheritance. Holt read it carefully. He read it the way solicitors read important things, with a steady, neutral voice that gave no signal of his own response to what was being said. Edmund had left Alara his entire private inheritance, not the estate that was entailed and could not be touched, but his personal funds, carefully built over years from his own investments, and the smaller properties that had been left to him specifically were now hers. The sum was large. It was, in fact, considerably larger than what she had been promised in the original arrangement, and she understood, sitting very still and looking at a point on the wall above Holt's head, that Edmund had known exactly what he was doing. He had spent the month since their wedding growing this provision, adding to it, because he had understood something she had not understood then, that the most important thing the money could do was not help her family, which it would also do. The most important thing it could do was give her a genuine choice. She could leave. She could leave Ashmore Hall, pay her family's debts, set Oliver back in his school, rebuild what the past 3 years had cost her family, and live independently and comfortably and never return. She looked at the wall. She heard Mr. Holt finish speaking. She heard Kaylan beside her say thank you to Holt in his even, controlled voice. She looked at the floor. She looked at the door. She thought about the drive lined with oak trees. She thought about the library on Tuesday afternoons. She thought about the kitchen at 10 at night and the lamp on the table. She thought about the east-facing windows with the April light coming through them low and sideways, and a man who had said, "I want to see ordinary things look remarkable." Holt closed his briefcase and said he would be in touch. He stood, they stood. He shook Kaylan's hand, and then unexpectedly he pressed Alara's hand briefly and said, "He thought very highly of you, Lady Ashmore. I wanted you to know that separately from the legal matter." She thanked him. She watched him go. She stood in the empty study with Kaylan standing 4 feet from her, looking at the window, and the silence was very large. After a long moment she went upstairs. She went to her room. She stood in the middle of it for a while. Then she opened the wardrobe and she took out a dress and she folded it and set it in the case she kept under the bed. She stopped. The dress was half folded. She was holding the other half of it. She stood there with the fabric in her hands and looked at the case, and the case looked back at her, blank and open and ready. She did not put the dress in it. She stood there for a very long time. The April afternoon light came through her windows, the same light that had been in Edmund's room, lower now, further into the afternoon, but the same quality of it, the same gold and white. She looked at the gardens below, beginning to be properly green now, the lavender just starting at the edges of the path to the chapel. She put the dress back in the wardrobe. She closed the wardrobe door. She pushed the case back under the bed with her foot. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, and she thought about the word she had used in her letter to her mother in January, staying, not staying until Edmund dies, just staying. She had known then, she had not known she had known. She knew now. Kaylan came to her room that evening just after 7. He knocked twice, which was the same knock Greaves used, clear, with appropriate distance, and she said come in, and he came in and stood just inside the door with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing the layered thing. "I wanted to speak to you," he said. "I know," she said. She was sitting in the chair near the window. She gestured at the chair across from it, the one that had no name in this room because it had rarely been used. "Sit down." He sat. He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked at her. She waited because she had learned that he needed space before the true thing. "The house," he said, and then stopped. She watched him. "The estate needs someone," he said. "The staff have grown accustomed to the way things run now. The interior has not been this well ordered in years." She listened. "I recognize," he said carefully, "that the provision Edmund made gives you the freedom to make any choice you wish. I am not suggesting that this circumstance should limit that." He paused. He looked at his hands. "I am trying to say something that I am not finding easy to say correctly." "You are listing reasons," she said. He looked up. "You are listing practical reasons," she said, "because you are not ready to say the true reason." He looked at her steadily. He was very still. "Say the true one," she said. The silence was long. She counted it the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder, not to know the distance but to know the quality of what is coming. "I do not want you to leave," he said. She held his gaze. "Not because of the house," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Not because of the estate or the staff or the way things run now." She waited. "Because this house is different when you are in it," he said. "Because I have spent 8 years managing something that I no longer have to manage alone, and I did not know what that would feel like until it happened, and I cannot." He stopped. He looked at his hands again. "I cannot reason my way back to not having known it." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about murmurations. She thought about small local decisions adding up to something that looked, from a distance, like intention. She thought about a man standing at a garden wall in October 2 years ago, learning something alone before he had to carry it. "I told you in December," she said, "that I want to be chosen, not needed, chosen." He looked at her. "I know the difference," he had said, on the night she had told him that. He had known. "Then choose," she said. He looked at her with the most complete version of the face that was underneath all the others, the real one, the one she had been seeing in glimpses for 4 months. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, with full attention, with the whole of himself present. "I choose," he said. 2 words. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood and crossed the room, not quickly, not slowly, just directly, and she put the empty case back in the wardrobe where it lived, and she shut the door and she turned around. "Then I am staying," she said. He stood. He crossed the distance between them until he was standing very close, not touching, just close, with that particular closeness that is its own kind of answer, the closeness of people who have moved through enough rooms together that the distance between them has changed its nature. He said very quietly, "I know." 2 words again, the same 2 words, but they meant a completely different thing this time, and they both knew it. Outside the window, the April evening was coming in on the gardens, and the lavender path was purple-gray in the last of the light, and the oak trees on the drive were in their first full leaf, green and full, and nothing like the bare things she had first arrived to in December. She looked at the gardens below. He came to stand beside her at the window, the same arrangement as the room where Edmund had died, but different now because the grief in it was mixed with something else that was not grief at all. They stood there for a while. "Kaylan," she said. "Yes." "The light in Portugal," she said. "Edmund said it comes in low from the sea in the late afternoon." A pause. "In June," he said. "The roads are reliable in June." She looked at him. He was looking at the gardens. The expression on his face was the open one, the impractical one, the one underneath the practical. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She had not told her mother yet. She had not written the letter. But she knew what it would say, and she knew it would be short, and she knew every sentence would be true. The last line would say, "I am not coming home. This is home now." 6 weeks later, on a warm morning in early June, she was sitting in the library in the low chair near the left window with a book she was not quite reading, because the light through the window was so good she kept stopping to look at it instead. The gardens were fully green now, deep and certain, and the lavender path was in bloom, and from where she sat she could see the stone chapel at the end of it, and the path to it, and the way the June morning light fell on the old gray stone and made it look not gray at all but something closer to warm. The door opened. She did not look up. Kaylan came in his work clothes, with ink on the second finger of his right hand. He set a folder of papers on the side table. He pulled the ladder to the east section. He went up and came back down with a book. He sat in the chair across from her with the book in his hand. He did not speak. She did not speak. The fire was not lit because it was June and did not need to be, but the room had the same quality it had always had, used and comfortable, organized by 2 different systems in permanent, comfortable negotiation. She went back to her book. He opened his. The morning light came through both windows at the same time and lay across the room in long gold rectangles, and in the rectangles everything it touched looked just slightly more than what it was. At some point, she did not know when exactly, because she had stopped watching the time, she looked up and he was already looking at her, in the way he sometimes looked at her now, openly, without the management. She looked back. She went back to her book, he went back to his. She thought about a man with maps on his wall and bright eyes and a notebook full of questions. She thought about question 9, what would you want said about you if you were not in the room? She thought about the answer she had not yet given because she was still working it out. She looked at the light on the floor. She thought that you were honest, that you told true things in the smallest number of words, that you chose people who were capable of choosing you back, that you made ordinary things look remarkable simply by believing that they were. She looked at the window, she looked at the man across from her reading. She thought that you left every room better than you found it. She did not say this. She held it in her chest with the other things that did not require saying, in that particular interior space that is not silence but is not quite words either, the space where people who have learned to be honest with each other put the things that are too real for language. The morning went on. The birds went on. The light went on coming through the windows the way good light always does, low and sideways and making ordinary things remarkable, making even the most unremarkable walls look gold. And in the library of Ashmore Hall, on a June morning that was not remarkable in any way that would have been visible from the outside, two people sat in two chairs and read two books and were, without announcing it, without making a story of it, without anything so large as a declaration or so small as a performance, entirely where they had always, in the end, been heading. Which was here? Which was home? Which was, as Edmund had promised, worth every single plan it had taken to arrive?